Blood pooled on the linoleum like spilled ink. The monitor's flatline shriek was deafening. Abigail had exactly 120 minutes. No attending surgeons, no backup, and 7 dying patients. When the rookie nurse picked up the scalpel, she didn't just break the rules, she shattered them. The neon sign of Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center flickered against the freezing November downpour. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of shift veteran nurses jokingly called a graveyard snooze. But for 23-year-old Abigail Hayes, it was anything but. Abigail was exactly 3 weeks off her clinical orientation. Her scrubs still held their factory stiffness, and her hands still trembled when she spiked an IV bag. She was a registered nurse in one of Spokane's busiest trauma centers, but tonight she was supposed to be shadowing. Fate, however, does not care about schedules. At 11:14 p.m., the red emergency phone at the nurse's station screamed. Diane Collins, the iron-willed charge nurse who had seen 30 years of blood and bone, picked it up. Abigail watched Diane's face drain of all color. "Multi-vehicle pileup on Interstate 90, Diane announced, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the ER. A commercial charter bus lost control on the black ice. It crossed the median and hit a chemical transport truck head-on. 30-plus casualties. EMS says it's a slaughterhouse out there. They are routing the absolute worst to us. ETA is 4 minutes. The ER erupted. The quiet night shattered into a chaotic ballet of ripping sterile packaging, shouting orders, and dragging crash carts into the trauma bays. But there was a glaring, fatal problem. The hospital was operating on a skeleton crew. Chief of Surgery, Dr. Harrison Miller, was attending a medical board gala on the opposite side of the Spokane River. The storm had just dropped 3 inches of freezing rain, turning the bridges into unnavigable death traps. The only attending trauma surgeon in the building was Dr. Felix Aris, a brilliant but aging physician who was already fighting exhaustion from a brutal 14-hour shift. At 11:18 p.m., the automatic doors blew open. Paramedics flooded the corridor, shouting over each other, pushing gurneys slick with crimson. The cold winter air rushed into the trauma bay, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of blood and the acrid sting of diesel fuel. "Bay 1, I need an airway now," shouted Jackson Reed, a veteran paramedic, his uniform soaked in dark red. Dr. Aris rushed to the gurney. On it lay a man in his 30s, his chest crushed by the steering column, gasping for air that his collapsed lungs couldn't hold. Abigail stood on the opposite side of the bed, her hands hovering, waiting for the surgeon's command. "Abby, push 10 of etomidate and 100 of succinylthonium. I need to intubate," Dr. Aris barked, reaching for the laryngoscope. Abigail pushed the paralytic drugs through the IV line. Dr. Aris leaned over the patient, his hands moving with practiced precision. But then, something went horribly wrong. Dr. Aris froze. He dropped the metal laryngoscope, the instrument clattering loudly onto the blood-stained floor. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound, and clutched his own chest. His face turned an unnatural shade of gray. "Dr. Aris?" Abigail asked, stepping forward. Before she could reach him, the senior surgeon's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Massive myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack. "Code Blue! Code Blue in Trauma 1!" Diane screamed from across the room, abandoning her triage station. 2 orderlies rushed in and dragged the unconscious Dr. Aris out into the hallway to begin CPR on him. Abigail was left standing alone in Trauma Bay 1. She looked down at the patient on the table. The paralyzing drugs had taken full effect. The man could not breathe on his own, and his airway was completely blocked by crushed cartilage. The heart monitor began to alarm, the rhythmic beeping slowing into an ominous, drawn-out drone. Oxygen saturation was plummeting. 80%, 72%, 65%. "Where is the backup surgeon?" Abigail screamed into the hallway. "Stuck on the Monroe Street Bridge," Diane yelled back, desperately compressing Dr. Aris's chest in the corridor. The chemical truck exploded on the highway. Hazmat locked down the perimeter. "We have no doctors getting in or out for at least 2 hours. We're on our own." Abigail looked around the massive trauma room. The paramedics had lined up 6 more stretchers against the wall, dropping off the most critical patients and sprinting back into the blizzard. 7 patients, all of them hovering on the razor's edge of death, all of them requiring immediate, invasive surgical intervention to survive. A nurse's license strictly dictates their scope of practice. Nurses administer medications, place IVs, monitor vitals, and assist. They do not cut. To make an incision, to perform a surgical procedure without a medical license, was a felony. It meant the immediate loss of a career, certain jail time, and the destruction of a life. The monitor attached to the man on the table dropped to 50%. His lips were turning blue. He had less than 2 minutes before brain death. Abigail looked at her trembling hands. She looked at the sterile surgical tray beside the bed. She thought of the medical board. She thought of the law. And then she looked at the dying man's face. To hell with the rules, she thought. Abigail snatched a number 10 scalpel from the stainless steel tray. The clock on the wall read 11:24 p.m. Abigail stood over the suffocating patient. "Jackson!" she yelled at the paramedic, who was staring at her in shock. "Hold his head steady. Hand me a size 6 endotracheal tube." "Abby, what are you doing?" Jackson panicked. "You can't do a cricothyrotomy. You're a nurse. You'll go to federal prison." "He's going to the morgue in 60 seconds if I don't," Abigail snapped. Her fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused adrenaline. She felt the man's neck, locating the cricothyroid membrane just below the Adam's apple. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the scalpel into the flesh, making a precise vertical incision. Blood welled up instantly. She swapped the scalpel for a hemostat, spreading the cartilage open, and jammed the breathing tube down into the trachea. She squeezed the ambu bag. The man's chest rose. The monitor beeped, the oxygen saturation climbing back into the 90s. "Surgery 1, Abigail whispered. Her gloves stained crimson. "Who's next?" Jackson stared at her, terrified but mesmerized. "Stretcher 2, shrapnel wound to the right thorax. He has a massive tension pneumothorax." Abigail rushed to the second patient. The woman's chest was ballooning on one side, the trapped air crushing her heart. Her blood pressure was practically non-existent. There was no time for anesthesia. Abigail grabbed a heavy-duty surgical trocar and a chest tube. She palpated the ribs, found the 5th intercostal space, and drove the sharp metal instrument through the woman's chest wall with a sickening crunch. A loud hiss of trapped air and a geyser of dark blood sprayed across Abigail's face mask, but the woman's heart monitor instantly stabilized. "Connect her to the pleural evac," Abigail ordered a terrified tech standing in the corner. Next, the ER had turned into a surreal nightmare. For the next 90 minutes, Abigail Hayes ceased to be a 23-year-old rookie. She became a machine. Patient 3 was bleeding to death from a severed femoral artery. Abigail didn't have time to carefully dissect the tissue. She jammed her fingers directly into the open wound on the man's thigh, blindly digging through muscle and fat until she felt the pulsing, severed end of the artery. She clamped it with her bare hand while Jackson blindly threw a surgical suture around the vessel, tying it off. Patient 4 was a young boy, barely 10 years old. He had a massive hematoma swelling on the side of his skull, his pupils blown wide, a sign of immense pressure crushing his brain. "We need a neurosurgeon," Jackson breathed, backing away. "Abby, you can't open a skull. It's impossible." "Get me the manual burr hole drill from the ortho cart," Abigail demanded, her voice devoid of emotion. "Abby, stop. This is butchery." "Do it," she roared. She shaved the side of the boy's head in 3 furious swipes, sterilized it with iodine, and took the stainless steel hand drill. With terrifying force, she bore down onto the child's skull. The sound of grinding bone echoed over the alarms. Crunch! The drill broke through. A jet of dark, pressurized blood shot out of the hole, relieving the pressure on the boy's brain. His blown pupils instantly constricted back to normal size. He was alive. By 1:15 a.m., the floor of Trauma Bay 1 was slick with bodily fluids. Discarded wrappers, bloody gauze, and dropped instruments littered the room. Abigail's scrubs were soaked through to her skin. Her arms ached. Her vision was swimming, but she kept moving. She performed an emergency pericardial window on patient 5, slicing open a woman's chest just beneath the sternum to drain fluid squeezing her heart. She stabilized patient 6's shattered pelvis using a makeshift external fixator drilled directly into the bone. Finally, patient 7. A pregnant woman whose spleen had ruptured on impact. She was bleeding out internally. Abigail performed a blind Riboa procedure, sliding a tiny balloon catheter up the woman's femoral artery and inflating it in the aorta to cut off blood flow to the abdomen, saving both the mother and the fetus. At 1:24 a.m., Abigail stepped back from the seventh gurney. The trauma bay was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic, steady beeping of 7 different heart monitors. All 7 patients were stabilized. All 7 were alive. Jackson slowly lowered his blood-soaked hands. He looked at the rookie nurse as if she were a god who had just descended from the heavens. "You did it," he whispered in awe. "You actually did it." Abigail leaned against the stainless steel counter, her chest heaving. She pulled off her surgical mask, her face pale and smeared with dried blood. She looked at the clock. Exactly 2 hours had passed. The adrenaline that had fueled her began to crash, leaving her violently trembling. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay hissed open. The storm outside had finally broken. The roads had cleared just enough. Dr. Harrison Miller, the chief of surgery, strode into the room still wearing his tuxedo from the gala, though the bow tie was undone. Beside him was Gregory Stanton, the ruthless chief administrator of Providence Sacred Heart, and 4 men in dark suits, hospital legal counsel. Dr. Miller stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes swept over the apocalyptic scene, the blood, the drilled skull, the chest tubes, the clamped arteries. He looked at the monitors, realizing that every single impossible procedure had been executed with ruthless, desperate precision. Abigail stood up straight, wiping a streak of blood from her forehead. She expected him to ask what happened. She expected relief. She expected them to take over. Instead, the hospital froze. The atmosphere didn't shift to gratitude. It plunged into a terrifying, icy silence. Gregory Stanton stepped over a pool of blood, his face a mask of absolute fury. He didn't look at the 7 living patients. He looked dead at Abigail. "Who gave you the authority to pick up a scalpel?" Stanton's voice was venomous, echoing off the tile walls. "There were no doctors," Abigail stammered, her voice cracking. "Dr. Eris had a heart attack. They were all going to die. I had to." "You are a nurse," Stanton barked, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You have no medical license. You just committed 7 counts of aggravated assault and unauthorized practice of medicine. You have exposed this hospital to hundreds of millions of dollars in liability." Dr. Miller stared at the burr hole in the child's skull, visibly pale. He looked at Abigail, not with awe, but with horror. "Abby, what have you done?" Before Abigail could speak, Stanton turned to the hospital security guards flanking the doorway. "Confiscate her badge," Stanton ordered coldly, "and call the Spokane Police Department. Have Abigail Hayes arrested immediately." The metallic clack of handcuffs snapping around Abigail's wrists sounded like a gunshot in the sterile quiet of the hospital corridor. 2 Spokane police officers, faces grim and unreadable, marched the 23-year-old nurse through the very emergency room she had just saved. She was still wearing her blood-soaked scrubs. The heavy metallic scent of iron clung to her skin, a grotesque perfume that parted the sea of staring doctors and bewildered night shift staff. Gregory Stanton, the chief administrator, stood by the reception desk with his arms crossed, watching her perp walk with dead, unblinking eyes. He had already set the hospital's crisis management machine into motion. By dawn, the narrative was completely rewritten. Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center was not a grossly understaffed facility that had abandoned its patients. It was the victim of a mentally unstable, rogue employee who had suffered a psychotic break and mutilated helpless victims. Abigail spent her first night in the freezing holding cell of the Spokane County Jail. She sat on the concrete bench, staring blankly at her hands. The dried blood of 7 people was still crusted beneath her fingernails. She had saved them. She knew she had. The monitor's steady rhythm still echoed in her ears. Yet, as the sun rose, the magnitude of the institution's betrayal began to crush her. Her assigned public defender, a perpetually exhausted man named Mitchell Reed, visited her the next afternoon. He dropped a massive stack of manila folders onto the metal table between them. "Abigail, you are in an unbelievable amount of trouble," Mitchell said, running a hand over his thinning hair. "The district attorney is charging you with 7 counts of practicing medicine without a license, 7 counts of aggravated battery, and reckless endangerment. They are treating you like a serial killer. The DA is asking for a cumulative sentence of 45 years. 45 years? Abigail whispered, the breath leaving her lungs. They were dying, Mitchell. Dr. Eris had a heart attack. The roads were closed. If I hadn't picked up that scalpel, 7 body bags would have rolled out of Trauma Bay 1. That's not what the hospital's official incident report says, Mitchell replied, his voice heavy with pity. He opened the top folder and slid a typed document toward her. According to Chief Administrator Stanton and Dr. Harrison Miller, the patients were critical but stable. They claimed Dr. Aris stepped out to recover from a mild angina episode, and in his brief absence, you bypassed all protocols, locked the trauma doors, and began performing unauthorized experimental butchery. Abigail stared at the paper. The words swam before her eyes. Stable? The man with the tension pneumothorax had a blood pressure of 40 over nothing. The boy with the epidural hematoma had blown pupils. Where is Jackson? The paramedic. He was there. He saw the whole thing. Mitchell sighed deeply, closing the folder. Jackson has been placed on indefinite administrative leave. The hospital has threatened to revoke his pension and blackball him from every EMS agency in the Pacific Northwest if he speaks to the press. And Diane, your charge nurse? She's suddenly taking an early retirement. The hospital has circled the wagons, Abigail. They are facing hundreds of millions in potential medical malpractice lawsuits from the bus crash victims. If the public finds out the region's premier trauma center had no surgeons on duty during a mass casualty event, the hospital will be shut down. They need a scapegoat, and you are holding the bloody knife. The next 3 months were a psychological crucifixion. Unable to post the $1 million bail, Abigail languished in a maximum security cell. The media devoured the story. National news networks dubbed her the Butcher Nurse of Spokane. Talk show hosts debated whether she was a narcissist suffering from a god complex or simply a deranged thrill seeker. Pundits tore apart her academic record, analyzing every minor mistake she had ever made in nursing school to paint a picture of a reckless, arrogant amateur. Through it all, the hospital maintained an iron grip on the victims. The 7 patients Abigail had saved were transferred to a secure, VIP recovery wing. Stanton deployed an army of hospital lawyers to their bedsides, offering them massive, multi-million-dollar out-of-court settlements. The condition? Ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The victims were told that a deranged nurse had unnecessarily mutilated them during their vulnerable state, and the hospital was graciously compensating them for her horrific crimes. Abigail was entirely isolated. Her family went into debt trying to hire private investigators, but doors slammed in their faces. The medical community abandoned her. Nursing unions, terrified of the PR nightmare, publicly condemned her actions. As the trial date approached, Mitchell looked increasingly defeated. "We have no expert witnesses, Abby," he confessed during one of their final jailhouse meetings. "No surgeon in the state is willing to testify that your actions were medically necessary. To do so would mean going to war with Providence Medical. They own this town. We are walking into a slaughter." On the first morning of the trial, a freezing rain battered the high windows of the Spokane County Courthouse, eerily mirroring the night of the crash. Abigail sat at the defense table, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit provided by the county. She looked frail, her cheekbones hollowed by months of prison food and relentless terror. Prosecutor Reynolds, a shark-like attorney with a booming voice, paced before the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reynolds began, pointing a dramatic finger at Abigail. "The woman sitting before you is not a hero. She is a dangerous, delusional vigilante. When chaos struck Providence Medical Center, she did not call for help. She did not follow protocol. She used a tragic accident as her own personal science experiment, taking scalpels and power drills to the bodies of unconscious victims. She played God, and today, she must face the wrath of the law." Abigail closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her pale cheek. She knew the truth, but in a courtroom, truth didn't matter. Only the narrative did. And the hospital's narrative was bulletproof. The trial progressed with brutal efficiency. Prosecutor Reynolds called a parade of hospital administrators and doctors to the stand. Dr. Harrison Miller, looking impeccable in a tailored suit, testified that the ER had been fully functional and that Abigail's actions were a horrifying deviation from standard medical care. Chief Administrator Stanton testified that Abigail had always displayed an insubordinate and aggressive demeanor, skillfully assassinating her character. Mitchell tried to cross-examine them, desperately pressing them on the timeline, asking why no surgeon was physically present in the room. But the hospital lawyers had coached them perfectly. They deflected, citing the storm, citing miscommunications, but always bringing the blame back to the rogue nurse. By the fourth day, the defense was in ruins. Mitchell leaned over to Abigail. "I'm sorry, Abby. We have nothing left. If you testify, Reynolds will tear you apart on the stand. We have to prepare for the sentencing." Abigail felt the room spinning. 45 years. Her life was over before it had truly begun. She looked out into the gallery, seeing the smug face of Gregory Stanton sitting in the second row, confident in his victory. "Call your next witness," Judge Harper commanded, looking over his spectacles at Mitchell. Mitchell stood up, defeated. "The defense rests, Your Honor." "Wait." A voice, raspy but commanding, echoed from the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The entire gallery turned. The bailiffs reached for their radios. Standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, was an elderly man. He was pale, his frame withered from months of muscular atrophy, and an oxygen cannula rested beneath his nose. But his eyes blazed with an unmistakable, furious intensity. It was Dr. Felix Arris. The courtroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Stanton leaped out of his seat, his face suddenly devoid of all blood. Prosecutor Reynolds frantically approached the bench. "Objection, Your Honor. This man is not on the witness list. He has been in a medically induced coma for 3 months." "I woke up last week, you arrogant fool," Dr. Arris rasped, slowly making his way down the center aisle. He locked eyes with Stanton, a look of pure disgust twisting his weathered face. "And I have spent the last 7 days reviewing exactly what this corrupt administration has been trying to bury." Judge Harper slammed his gavel. "Order! Dr. Arris, what is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Your Honor," Dr. Arris said, finally reaching the wooden gate, "is that I am here to testify for the defense, and I brought evidence." He held up a small, silver USB drive. Mitchell, stunned, rushed forward to help the frail surgeon into the witness box. After being sworn in, Dr. Arris adjusted the microphone. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the rain hitting the glass. "Dr. Arris," Mitchell began, his voice trembling with newfound hope. "Can you tell us what happened on the night of November 12th? "I suffered a massive widowmaker heart attack," Dr. Arris stated clearly. "I collapsed directly onto the floor of Trauma Bay 1. And contrary to what my esteemed colleague Dr. Miller testified, I did not step out for a breather. I was clinically dead for 4 minutes. The emergency room was completely abandoned by the surgical staff. We were dangerously understaffed because Mr. Stanton over there refused to approve overtime pay for the on-call surgical team." Stanton lunged forward. "That is a lie. He's senile. The patients were stable." "Sit down, Mr. Stanton," Judge Harper roared, slamming his gavel. "Continue, doctor." "The patients were dying," Dr. Arris said, his voice dropping to a somber, emotional register. He looked directly at Abigail, his eyes shimmering with tears. "I woke up in the ICU. I demanded to see the charts of the bus crash victims. I looked at the arterial blood gases. I looked at the intracranial pressure monitors. I looked at the hemorrhage rates." Dr. Arris turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, a tension pneumothorax will kill a patient in 3 minutes. A severed femoral artery will drain the human body of blood in 4 minutes. An epidural hematoma will cause irreversible brain herniation in under 20 minutes. Abigail Hayes did not have the luxury of waiting for the storm to clear. She did not have the luxury of calling for a consult." He pointed a shaking finger at Abigail. "That young woman performed 7 highly complex, invasive surgical procedures flawlessly. In the dark, in the mud, against the law. If she had hesitated for even 60 seconds, 7 people would be in the ground right now. What she did was not butchery. It was the greatest display of raw medical brilliance and courage I have ever seen in my 40 years of practicing medicine." The jury sat in stunned silence. But Dr. Arris wasn't finished. "And as for the hospital's timeline," Dr. Arris said, lifting the USB drive, "Paramedic Jackson Reed visited me secretly in the hospital yesterday. He was terrified of losing his pension. But EMS protocol requires all paramedics to wear active body microphones during mass casualty events. The hospital administrators didn't know the mics were still recording when they entered the trauma bay." Mitchell took the drive and plugged it into the court's audio system. The raw, terrifying audio filled the courtroom. The jury heard the shrieking alarms. They heard Dr. Eris hit the floor. They heard the frantic, heroic actions of Abigail, barking orders, fighting death with her bare hands. But most damning of all, they heard the exact moment Stanton and Miller walked into the room 2 hours later. They heard Stanton's voice clearly through the speakers. She saved them all, but she's not a doctor. If the press finds out we left a rookie nurse alone with 7 dying patients, the state will pull our charter, confiscate her badge, pin it on her, say she went crazy. It's the only way to save the hospital. The audio cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Gregory Stanton sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Dr. Harrison Miller stared at the floor, knowing his career was entirely obliterated. Prosecutor Reynolds slowly packed his briefcase, not even waiting for the judge to speak. He looked at the jury, looked at the judge, and simply shook his head. The state drops all charges, Your Honor. And we would like to formally request arrest warrants for Gregory Stanton and Dr. Harrison Miller for perjury, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy. The gavel slammed down one final time. Case dismissed. Abigail broke down. She collapsed into Mitchell's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as the immense weight of the past 3 months vanished. The gallery erupted into cheers. Dr. Eris smiled warmly, nodding at her from the witness stand. In the aftermath, Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center faced the largest federal investigation in Washington state history. Stanton and Miller were both sentenced to federal prison. The 7 patients, finally freed from the lies of the hospital's legal team, publicly hailed Abigail as their guardian angel. The state medical board, acknowledging the unprecedented circumstances, offered Abigail a full reinstatement of her nursing license, along with an unprecedented commendation for extreme valor in the line of duty. But Abigail Hayes did not return to the nursing station. 2 years later, fueled by the terrifying fire she discovered within herself that night, she walked through the doors of the University of Washington School of Medicine. She wasn't going to stand beside the table waiting for orders anymore. She was going to be the surgeon. Abigail's terrifying trial proves that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking every rule in the book and fighting the very system meant to protect you. The truth always leaves a pulse. If this incredible story of medical heroism, deep corruption, and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video to spread Abigail's amazing journey. And make sure you subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable, true-life, dramatic stories.
Hi, my name is Tran Than, the owner and manager of Noble Tales. After watching the video, rookie nurse performed 7 surgeries in 2 hours, then the hospital froze. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the tension between doing what feels right in a crisis and facing the consequences afterward. Watching Abigail make impossible decisions under pressure creates a mix of admiration, worry, and reflection about courage, responsibility, and integrity. It also reminds us that difficult moments can reveal strengths we never knew we had. Do you think you would have made the same decision in her position? And what part of the story stood out to you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story gave you something to think about, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to Noble Tales for more unforgettable stories. Thanks for watching and being part of our community.